They said the husky was a beast with madness in its eyes, that it had bitten men, shattered leashes, and could never be trusted again. But when the most powerful landowner in High Mesa laughed and wagered his finest land against the life of a nameless mountain man, he made one fatal mistake. The man wasn't there to tame the dog. He wasn't there to dominate it. He stepped forward, looked into its eyes, because he wasn't meeting a monster. He was meeting someone. In the high country above High Mesa, New Mexico, where late summer heat turns the air thin and metallic, and the mesas stand like weathered fortresses against a white, pitiless sky, Evan Cole lived alone in a small, hand-built cabin that clung to the edge of a juniper slope, the kind of place the wind found first and the world forgot last. The mornings came bright and hard, the light so clean it felt sharp, and the nights cooled fast enough to remind you that mountains keep their own calendar, no matter what the towns below insist. And inside that cabin, the silence was never truly empty, because it carried the soft creak of timber, the slow tick of cooling metal, and the steady presence of the only soul Evan trusted without reservation. His canine, a large German shepherd named Rook, 9 years old by the paperwork, but older in the eyes. Black and tan, with a scar that ran like a pale seam along his left shoulder where shrapnel once kissed too close. The dog's ears always half-tilted toward a sound nobody else could hear. His discipline so ingrained he could freeze mid-step at a hand signal, yet his loyalty so personal that he slept where he could keep Evan in sight. Evan was 38, built lean and hard from a life that had taught him to carry weight quietly. His hair cut short at the sides, but grown a little too long on top, the way it happens when a man stops caring about mirrors. His beard rough with gray threading through it, and his eyes the color of storm rock. Calm until they weren't. Watchful as a habit, not a choice. He wore what worked. A sun-faded work shirt, a brown leather jacket that had molded to his shoulders like a second hide, and boots that remembered long distances. And if anyone in town asked, he was just that mountain guy who did fence repairs and odd ranch work when the season demanded it. But the truth sat deeper under the skin. Evan had been special forces once, the kind of man trained to move through darkness and make decisions that couldn't be undone. And the event that changed him was not the one people would guess from movies, not a gunfight or an explosion alone, but a moment afterward, when the mission was over and the noise was gone, and he realized the hardest part was returning to a life that expected him to be ordinary again. He had come to the mountains because they didn't ask questions, because the ridgelines didn't care what he had done, because the wind never demanded an explanation, and because Rook, sensing the fractures in him the way canines do, had stayed close in that loyal, wordless way that felt almost like grace. That morning, the heat already pressed against the cabin walls. Evan fed Rook, checked the water, and drove down toward the main ranch land for seasonal work. Not because he needed company, but because solitude still required groceries and gas, and because the ranches paid cash for a man who didn't complain. And as he rolled into the biggest spread in the region, the Rourke place, he could feel the temperature change in a different way, the kind of psychological heat that rises when men gather to witness something they can't control. Cal Rourke stood at the center of it all, like a monument to ownership, wealthy enough that even his casual posture looked like entitlement. A broad-shouldered landowner in his late 50s, with a sun-polished face and a smile that carried more mockery than warmth, dressed in crisp ranch clothes that somehow never seemed to pick up dust the way everyone else's did. His hat clean, his belt buckle bright, his laugh loud enough to make smaller men shrink, and he had a reputation for believing anything with breath or heartbeat could be purchased and bent to his will. The corral was ringed with cowboys and ranch hands leaning against rough timber rails, some hoping for a free show, others for a free drink later, all of them keeping a careful distance from the center, where a large Siberian husky paced like a storm contained in fur, massive and wolf-built with a coat the color of gunsmoke, silver gray layered over darker shadow, and eyes a cold, bright blue that seemed to evaluate every human the way a judge weighs a lie. And people didn't call the dog by any gentle name, not anymore, because stories traveled faster than truth out here. So they called him Ghost Jaw, and the nickname tasted like fear. The husky that had snapped through a glove, the husky that had forced a man to get stitches, the husky that made ropes feel thin and courage feel expensive. Evan stayed near the back by the troughs at first, the way he always did, quiet, useful, invisible. And Rook sat at his heel in perfect control, scanning the crowd without provoking it, while Cal talked big about breaking spirits and proving points, and the men around him chuckled the way men do when they're too intimidated to disagree. The handler today was Wade, an older cowboy with a weathered face and a stance that tried to look steady even as his grip betrayed him, holding the leather lead with hands that had seen decades of horses and cattle, but not many animals that looked back with that kind of flinty intelligence. And Ghost Jaw's posture stayed coiled, head low, shoulders forward, tail stiff, like a question nobody wanted to answer. Then a county truck pulled in, and with it came a small ripple in the crowd, because authority in rural places shows up in subtle uniforms and official clipboards, and stepping out with the veterinary inspection team was Lila Hart, young enough to still carry idealism in the set of her shoulders, but composed in a way that said she'd already learned how quickly things could go wrong around frightened animals. Her hair pulled back, practical, her gaze clear and focused, boots dusty like she'd actually walked the pens instead of just signing papers. And the moment she saw Ghost Jaw, she didn't smirk or flinch like the others. Her expression tightened with concern, as if she could see past the nickname into the stress under the fur. Evan noticed that because he noticed the small things, because training taught him to watch hands and faces, and because something in Lila's steady presence cut through the carnival mood like clean water through grit. And for a heartbeat their eyes met across the rails, hers questioning, his unreadable. And in that brief exchange there was a strange, quiet recognition. They were the only two not enjoying the spectacle. Cal kept talking, louder now, turning the whole scene into theater, and Ghost Jaw responded the way animals do when humans get careless with pride. His pacing tightened, his breath quickened, the muscles along his neck rippling under the harness, while Wade shifted his feet and tried to keep his voice calm, and several cowboys leaned back instinctively, as if distance could protect them from a story becoming real. Evan's attention fixed on the husky's face, not the teeth, not the growl, but the eyes, because eyes told the truth before the mouth ever did. And what he saw there wasn't simple aggression. It wasn't the empty rage Cal wanted to sell to the crowd. It was something more complicated, something threaded with fear and memory, like a dog trying to decide whether the world was about to hurt him again. Rook, at Evan's side, made a low sound in his chest, barely audible, an alert more than a warning, and Evan felt the hairs at the back of his neck rise in the old way. Not because he feared the dog, but because the situation smelled wrong. Too many men, too much ego, too little understanding. Lila stepped closer to the rail with her clipboard, her posture controlled, her face composed, but her eyes sharp, reading the signs the way professionals do, ears pinned, lip tension, weight distribution, while Cal's laughter rolled on, careless as a tossed match near dry hay. And Evan, against his usual rule of staying invisible, found his boots carrying him forward until he stood close enough to the fence that the husky's gaze flicked to him and held. And in that instant the noise of the crowd seemed to thin, as if the mountains themselves leaned in to listen, because Evan did not look at Ghostjaw like a problem to solve or a beast to conquer. He looked at him like a sentence he already knew how to finish. Cal's laugh spiked at something someone said. The ranch hands chuckled on cue. Wade tightened his grip, and Lila's eyes shifted from the dog to Evan with a quick, uncertain question, while Evan's face stayed calm, his jaw setting in a way that meant he'd recognized something no one else had, something buried beneath the nickname and the fear and the showmanship. And as the bright New Mexico sun bleached the world into crisp edges, wood grain, dust motes, hat brims, the hard line of the horizon, Evan narrowed his eyes at Ghostjaw, not in challenge, but in recognition, as if an old, half-forgotten piece of his life had just stepped out of the shadows and into them.
Light, and the corral, for all its noise, suddenly felt like the quietest place in the world.
The heat over the corral thickened as if the land itself were holding its breath, and when Cal Rourke lifted his hand with a casual flick of the wrist, Wade did what he had always done in 40 years of ranch work. He obeyed, though this time obedience tasted like rust in his mouth. Wade was a tall, sinewy old cowboy with skin cracked by decades of sun and wind, the kind of man who had once broken colts before breakfast and buried friends before sundown. And as he stepped forward, dragging Ghostjaw toward the open dirt pen, his knuckles went white around the lead, betraying the truth his face tried to hide. Because the husky was no horse and no cow, and the energy coiled under that silver-gray coat was sharp and unpredictable, the dog's throat vibrating with a low growl that rolled through the crowd like distant thunder, his neck stiff as cable, muscles bunched and ready, while Cal watched with a satisfied smirk, enjoying the way men leaned back and investors murmured, mistaking fear for respect. It was then that Evan's voice cut through the noise, not loud, not pleading, but level and grounded, the way men speak when they are used to being heard in chaos, telling Cal that he was frightening the dog and that fear, once planted, grows teeth of its own. And the laughter that followed was instant and cruel, Cal turning slowly as if savoring the insult, his eyes narrowing under the brim of his immaculate hat as he sized up the man in the worn leather jacket who dared speak out of turn, calling him a hired hand, a nobody, a speck of dust on land he owned outright. But Evan didn't flinch or raise his voice. He simply added that if Cal let him close, he would only touch the dog's neck, nothing more. A statement so modest it struck Cal's pride like a slap. The landowner's grin hardened into something sharper, because men like Cal did not tolerate the quiet confidence of those beneath them. And with a dramatic sweep of his arm toward the northern hills, he made the wager public, binding it not with paper, but with witnesses and ego, promising 1,200 acres of prime land if Evan could stand face to face with Ghostjaw, meet his eyes, and place both hands on his neck without being bitten. While the alternative, unspoken but understood, hung in the air like a sentence already passed. The crowd erupted, some in disbelief, others in hungry anticipation, because the West still remembered stories where words mattered more than signatures. And Wade stared at Evan as if seeing him for the first time, knowing how thin the line was between courage and foolishness. While Lila Hart pushed forward from the veterinary truck, her voice sharp with professional authority and something more personal, urging Cal to stop, reminding him that lives were not currency, that fear-driven animals were not props. And Cal dismissed her with a laugh that carried the old, familiar contempt of powerful men toward those who challenged them with reason, telling her to
Tend to bandages and leave the rules of the land to those who owned it.
Through it all, Evan kept his gaze on Ghostjaw, not on Cal, not on the crowd. And Lila noticed that too, noticed how Evan's posture held no hunger for reward, no flicker of triumph, only a strange, almost aching focus, as if he were measuring distance not in feet, but in years. And when their eyes met briefly over the rail, Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the heat, because she recognized that look from her own past, the look of someone reaching for something lost rather than grasping for gain. Evan nodded once, a small motion that nevertheless carried the weight of commitment, and said, "Deal," with a steadiness that quieted the corral more effectively than any shout, prompting murmurs to fade into a taut silence as Cal clapped his hands and barked for the gate to be opened, savoring the spectacle he believed he had already won, while Wade led Ghostjaw into the center of the dirt ring, the dog's paws kicking up dust that clung to his fur and the air alike, his eyes flashing toward Evan with that same searching intensity. And somewhere behind Evan, Rook remained seated, still as stone, his trained senses cataloging every shift of wind and movement of muscle, a guardian in reserve. As the terms of the wager settled into the bones of the moment, small details surfaced that would later matter, the way Cal's investors leaned in, phones half raised to capture proof, the way Wade's jaw worked as if chewing regret, the way Lila's hands curled into fists at her sides, torn between duty and dread, and the way Evan rolled his shoulders once, loosening them not for a fight, but for a reunion he had not yet named. The dirt ring felt suddenly like a threshold, a place where the past pressed against the present, and Evan took one step closer to the rail, the sun bleaching the scene into stark contrasts, silver fur, brown leather, pale dust, while Cal's voice rang out, satisfied and sharp, declaring the terms complete and witnessed, and for a fleeting instant the land itself seemed to lean in, the mesas standing silent and ancient, as if curious whether this wager would be settled by teeth and blood or by something far older and quieter. And with that question hanging unanswered, Evan rested his hands on the top rail and prepared to cross into the space where fear and memory waited together. The journey begun and the trial poised, neither victory nor loss yet written, only the undeniable pull of fate drawing tight like a cinched rope. The wooden gate groaned as it swung inward, its sound sharp enough to set every nerve on edge, and Evan stepped into the open dirt ring alone, leaving behind the low murmur of the crowd and the certainty of safety, carrying nothing with him but his own breath and the quiet discipline etched into his bones. No stick, no chain, no trick of dominance, just bare hands held loose at his sides, while Ghostjaw stood opposite him like a storm paused mid-turn, silver-gray fur bristling, blue eyes rolling white at the edges as instinct and memory wrestled for control. And the space between them felt vast, despite being only a few yards wide, a distance measured less in steps than in years. Evan did not advance the way trainers did, with calculated angles and sharp commands, nor did he retreat, because retreat would have taught fear a lesson it didn't deserve. Instead, he planted his boots in the dust and let his shoulders drop, loosening the tension from his frame in a way that spoke a language older than words, one Rook had learned long ago in different deserts under different skies. And when Evan bent forward, slowly, deliberately, the movement mirrored the image burned into the minds of those watching. Man lowering himself not in submission, but in invitation, his hands hovering just inches from the husky's thick neck, close enough to feel the heat of muscle and the tremor beneath the fur, but not yet touching. And Ghostjaw's growl deepened, a raw sound pulled from the chest, his hackles rising as his eyes darted between Evan's face and those waiting hands, the crowd freezing as one body, Wade's mouth falling open, Cal's confident posture stiffening as if something unplanned had entered the equation. Evan spoke then, not to the ranch, not to Cal, but to the animal before him, his voice low and uneven, the way it got when he spoke around memories that still carried weight, asking quietly if the dog remembered him. The words barely audible, yet somehow louder than all the laughter that had come before. And outside the ring, Lila felt her heart hammer as she watched the subtle signs her training had taught her to see. The shift in the husky's breathing, the fraction of a second where his eyes softened from rage into confusion, the way his ears flicked, not forward in attack, but sideways in uncertainty. And she understood then what others did not. That this was not a battle being fought, but a wound being approached. As Evan held his position, time folded inward on itself, and memory bled into the present, carrying him back to Flagstaff, Arizona, to a sagging little house with peeling paint and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. To evenings where a younger Evan had knelt on cracked pavement behind a gas station, coaxing a half-starved husky pup from beneath a dumpster with bits of jerky, naming him Sky because the dog's eyes had reminded him of open space and the promise of escape. To nights when Sky lay curled against his sister's feet while their mother coughed herself to sleep, and to the last night before everything fell apart, when Evan had sat on the edge of his bed staring at foreclosure papers while Sky pressed his head against the door as if standing guard against a future he could sense but not stop. The present snapped back into focus as Evan whispered a single word that did not belong to the myth Cal had sold to the crowd. A name spoken softly, but with conviction. Sky. And the effect was immediate and devastating, because Ghost Jaw stilled as if struck by an invisible hand, his growl faltering into a breath, his ears lowering inch by inch, the hardness in his eyes cracking like ice under sudden warmth, and he leaned forward, inhaling deeply, catching the layered scents clinging to Evan's jacket, leather worn by years, sweat earned honestly, and beneath it all, the faint trace of something familiar that memory recognized before instinct could object. Evan lowered himself further, closing the last inch, both hands settling firmly but gently into the thick fur at the dog's neck, his grip steady, not claiming ownership but offering grounding. And when he lifted his gaze, he did so with a smile that surprised even him, small and unguarded, directed straight into the husky's eyes. And Sky, no longer Ghost Jaw, released a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty him of seasons spent caged by misunderstanding, his body sagging just enough to show trust reborn, while a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers as Wade stared in open disbelief and Cal's face drained of color. The confidence he had worn like armor suddenly brittle and thin. Outside the ring, Lila pressed a hand to her mouth, her professional detachment dissolving as she watched a reunion unfold that textbooks could never explain. Seeing not a man taming an animal, but two survivors recognizing each other across time. And when Evan glanced up briefly and their eyes met, he did not speak, but the gratitude there was unmistakable. A silent acknowledgement that she had seen the truth when it mattered, that she had not laughed or turned away. And in that fleeting exchange, something warm and tentative sparked between them, fragile as first light, yet real, a promise neither dared name. Cal took an involuntary step backward, the weight of his wager settling in with sudden clarity as the crowd shifted from mockery to awe, phones lowering, mouths closing, because they were witnessing something that could not be bought or forced. And as Sky leaned subtly into Evan's hands, accepting the touch with a sigh that sounded almost human, The dust hung suspended in the bright New Mexico air, the mesas silent and watchful, and the corral became a place where a buried name had been spoken aloud at last, where a life thought lost had stepped back into the light, and where the terms of honor were no longer theoretical, but breathing, waiting for the next move to be made.
Cal Rourke's voice shattered the stunned silence like a bottle breaking against stone, sharp with accusation and wounded pride, shouting that it was a trick, that Evan must have trained the dog beforehand or drugged it somehow, his words tumbling out faster as the ground beneath his authority cracked. And before the echo of his anger could fade, Lila stepped forward with a steadiness born of long nights in clinics and barns, her posture straight, her tone clipped and professional as she declared, in front of investors and ranch hands alike, that there were no drugs, no sedatives, no manipulation at work here, only recognition and trust. Concepts Cal had never learned to respect. Evan did not raise his voice to counter the accusation, did not argue the science or the ethics. He merely spoke with the same calm that had steadied Sky moments earlier, telling Cal that he had purchased a stolen dog and locked him into fear until the animal had no choice but to wear the mask of a monster. That Ghost Jaw was something Cal had created out of neglect and cruelty, and the truth of it landed harder than any insult, because it was spoken plainly, without heat, and could not be laughed away. Cal's face flushed an ugly red as he looked around at the men who usually nodded at his every word, at the investors who now shifted uncomfortably, and in that instant, he felt something unfamiliar and intolerable, the sensation of losing control in public. And as often happened with men who built their lives on dominance, that loss curdled quickly into rage. He spun on his heel and stormed toward his pickup truck, boots kicking dust, movements jerky and unrestrained. And when he yanked open the door and reached inside, the metallic scrape of a hunting rifle being pulled free cut through the air, sending a wave of panic rippling through the corral as cowboys scattered back from the rails and voices rose in alarm. Wade stumbled away instinctively, decades of survival reflex overriding loyalty, and Lila moved without thinking, stepping between the ring and Cal, her arms spread in a futile shield as she shouted for him to put the gun down, her face pale but resolute, while Evan remained where he was, positioning himself fully in front of Sky, one hand still resting at the dog's neck like an anchor driven deep into the ground, his body squared, his stance unyielding. Not because he believed himself invincible, but because he understood that running would only confirm Cal's power. Evan spoke then, measured and firm, telling Cal that pulling the trigger would cost him far more than land, that it would cost him freedom, reputation, everything he believed himself untouchable in. And for a breathless second the world narrowed to the dark circle of the rifle's barrel and the small, definitive sound of the safety clicking off, a sound that made even the mountains seem to lean closer. Sky did not lunge or snarl, did not bare his teeth, but pressed subtly into Evan's leg, sensing danger with an instinct sharpened by past betrayals, and Evan felt the weight of that trust settle over him like armor, steadying his breath. The confrontation might have ended very differently if not for the sudden arrival of Sheriff Mara Keene, her cruiser rolling in fast and deliberate, dust pluming behind it. Mara herself stepping out with the efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that hesitation cost lives. Her hair pulled back tight, her uniform worn but immaculate, her face lined with the kind of resolve earned by years of standing between small communities and big egos. And she drew her sidearm with practiced ease, leveling it at Cal as she called his name and ordered him to lower the weapon, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of the law Cal could not buy. She named the situation for what it was, attempted murder in front of witnesses, and the words hit Cal harder than Evan's calm ever could, forcing his arm to sag, though the hatred in his eyes remained sharp and alive as he finally dropped the rifle into the dirt with a snarl, promising as he turned away that this was not over, that accidents happened when the night grew cold. Sheriff Keene watched him go with a look that promised consequences, then turned to Evan and Lila, issuing quick, clear instructions to stabilize the situation, assigning a deputy to remain on site until morning and making it plain that no one would be leaving without her say-so. And as the crowd dispersed in low, nervous clusters, the corral slowly emptied, leaving behind the churned dust and the echo of something irreversible having occurred. Dusk settled over the ranch with deceptive calm, the desert air cooling rapidly as shadows stretched long and blue across the ground. And Evan made a choice that surprised no one who had truly been watching. He asked to stay near the barn for the night, to remain with Skye where the dog could feel safe, because he knew Cal's threat was not idle. And Sheriff Keene agreed, posting her deputy near the main drive, trusting Evan's judgment in the quiet way professionals often trust one another. When night fully claimed the land, the barn became a small island of lamplight and hay-scented warmth amid the vast dark, and it was there that Lila returned quietly, her footsteps careful, carrying a small first aid kit and a folded blanket, her silhouette framed briefly in the doorway before she stepped inside, her voice low as she told Evan that he had won the wager, but that the moment after victory was often the most dangerous, because pride wounded did not heal cleanly. Evan looked at her then in the lantern's soft glow, seeing not just a veterinarian doing her duty, but a woman choosing to stand where it mattered. And he asked her if she wasn't afraid of becoming a target herself, his tone gentle, almost curious. And Lila smiled with a tired honesty that stripped the fear of its power, admitting that she was afraid, but that she had learned long ago, after losing a horse she loved because she hesitated, that fear was no excuse for abandonment. They fell into a shared silence after that, the kind that did not demand filling, broken only by the rustle of sky settling down and the distant sound of wind threading through the high mesas. And in that quiet, something fragile and undeniable took shape between them. Not a promise, not yet, but the sense of two lives brushing against one another at a point of change, offering warmth against the night. Evan leaned back against a stall post, eyes open, keeping watch, while Lila sat nearby for a time before leaving reluctantly under the sheriff's orders. And as the barn lights dimmed and the desert stars burned cold and bright overhead, Evan understood that the real trial had only just begun. That the land might be his by word and witness, but the darkness still held teeth, and that standing his ground tonight was not about winning a bet, but about protecting the life, human and canine, that trusted him enough to stay. Dawn crept in, thin and colorless over high mesa, the sky paling from ink to bone as the desert held its breath, and it was Skye who felt it first, the husky's ears snapping upright as a sound threaded the quiet that did not belong. The soft, deliberate scrape of boots where no boots should be, prompting Evan to still his own breathing and reach instinctively for the lantern wick, snuffing the light until the barn fell into a hush broken only by hay shifting and the distant hum of wind. Outside, a shape slid past the feed storage with a gas can swinging low, metal catching a sliver of moon, and Evan's mind cataloged the moment with a soldier's clarity, distance, intent, timing, while his heart thudded with the knowledge that Cal Rourke had chosen fire as his last argument. The kind of erasure that left no witnesses if it worked. Across the yard, Sheriff Mara Keene, finishing a quiet check with her deputy, heard the same wrongness in the night, the way lawmen learn to hear it, and Lila, nearby with her clipboard and a coat pulled tight, felt the prickle along her arms before she saw the movement. Instinct marrying training as she reached for the radio. Evan laid a calming hand along Sky's shoulder, murmuring not commands, but trust. And the dog responded not with blind aggression, but with purpose, exploding into sound at Evan's signal, a full-throated alarm that shattered the night and sent the shadow stumbling backward as Sky surged forward to block the storage door, teeth bared, not to tear, but to warn. Body a living barrier between flame and timber. Flashlight snapped on, white beams slicing the dark as Sheriff Keene closed the distance with practiced speed, her voice cutting through panic. And there, caught in the sudden clarity, Cal stood, with gasoline sloshing at his boots and a lighter clutched like a talisman of control. His face, a mask of fury and fear that collapsed into something smaller when the cuffs came out. The miracle of restraint delivered not by force alone, but by the dog he had tried to turn into a monster, standing firm without striking, a lesson in mercy Cal would never understand. The morning that followed was brittle with consequence, the ranch alive with murmurs and camera lenses as word spread, and 3 days later the reckoning arrived, not in a courthouse of marble, but in the open air of the main corral, where a folding table served as bench and the land itself bore witness beneath a sky bleached white. Judge Whitaker presiding with the efficiency of a man who despised theater and loved truth. Sheriff Keene standing nearby with her quiet gravity, and Cal Rourke seated at the defense table, diminished by a rumpled suit and the knowledge that power had finally met a boundary. The county attorney played the recording of the wager, Cal's own voice ringing out across the dirt with its promises and conditions, while witnesses, Wade among them, shoulders slumped with relief, confirmed what they had heard. And then Lila stepped forward with the final piece, her hands steady as she presented the microchip scan and the Arizona registry, explaining how Sky's identification traced back to a foreclosure tangled in fraud, how names had been changed and papers forged, how a dog had been stolen and sold under a lie, until fear finished the work neglect began, and the corral rippled with a sound like wind through grass as the truth landed. Evan listened without triumph, Sky seated at his side, calm and watchful, the dog's presence itself an argument more compelling than any brief. And when Judge Whitaker delivered the ruling, 1,200 acres transferred by the terms spoken and witnessed, criminal charges proceeding for attempted arson and assault, Sky returned to his rightful owner. The cheer that rose was less a roar than a release. Caps tossed skyward, hands clapped shoulders, and Cal escorted away with his jaw set against a future he could no longer command. Yet the miracle did not end at paper and punishment, because Evan stood when the dust settled and did something no one expected, announcing that the land would not become a monument to victory, but a refuge, a place where broken animals could be taught safety again, naming it Sky Haven, not as an act of possession, but of gratitude. And the idea took root immediately. Neighbors offering lumber, a farrier volunteering time, Lila committing her skills without condition, the West remembering how communities used to answer need. Months passed in a montage of quiet work, the creak of new posts set true, the lowing of rescued horses finding rhythm, dogs learning that hands could mean care. And on an evening when the mesas burned purple and gold, Evan stood on the porch of a modest house built from that shared effort. Sky sprawled between his boots with his chin heavy and content, while Lila leaned against the rail beside him, no longer a visitor, but a partner in purpose, telling him softly that he had found his dog again. And Evan,
smiling with a weariness that carried peace, corrected her gently, saying he had found home. Below them, the land breathed, not as property, but as promise. And the miracle, small, stubborn, unmistakable, settled into the bones of High Mesa. Proof that when a word is kept and fear is met with patience, even the wildest stories can end with a door left open and a light kept on. Sometimes what we call a miracle is not lightning from the sky or a voice from the clouds. Sometimes it is simply a moment when someone chooses kindness over fear, patience over power, and truth over pride. In this story, the miracle did not come from force or wealth. It came from a man who remembered a name, and from an animal who remembered trust. And maybe that is how God works more often than we realize. Not by changing the world all at once, but by placing us exactly where we are needed, at the exact moment someone or something is waiting to be seen. In our daily lives, we all
Meet situations that feel broken beyond repair. People who seem angry, animals that seem dangerous, moments that feel lost. But sometimes the problem is not that they are broken. It is that they have been forgotten. If you believe in God, then believe this as well. He does not always remove the storm. Sometimes he sends us into it with a steady heart and asks us to stand still when everyone else runs. That quiet courage can be the miracle. If this story touched you, think about one place in your own life where you can choose patience instead of control. Think about one person or one situation that might just need to be remembered instead of judged. Please share this story with someone who loves animals, justice, or quiet strength. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, or share a moment when kindness changed something in your life. Your words may become someone else's hope. Subscribe to the channel if you believe stories like this still matter. And may God bless you, protect you, and guide you wherever you are watching from.